Welcome everybody. Today's chapter 40, is called Jews and Gentiles. The story of the church, from the conversion of Paul, probably in AD 32, until his death in AD 64, is largely the story of Paul himself. There were, of course, countless other Christians, named and unnamed, who played their part in spreading the faith from Palestine through the whole civilized world during these crucial decades. But the mastermind behind the strategy, which had by the end of that time established a network of tiny groups of Christians from Jerusalem to Rome and held them together as members of one church, was undoubtedly Paul's. It meant endless travelling by sea and on land, visiting and revisiting congregations, settling disputes, giving encouragement and advice, and enduring unbelievable hardships. Yet amid all this, he found time to write a remarkable series of letters to the various communities and to a variety of people. Some of them have been lost, but some of them have found their place in the New Testament side by side with the Gospels as foundation documents of the Christian faith. In telling the story of Paul, we have therefore not only Luke's narrative in the book of Acts, but supplementary information from Paul's own letters, which reveal a man's mind as nothing else can. When Paul reached Damascus after his conversion, physically stricken and in turmoil of spirit, with no reason to expect anything but hostility and distrust from the Christians he set out to crush, he was put on his feet by two simple words spoken by an obscure believer in that city who called him Brother Saul. This acceptance of the scourge of the saints as one of themselves led to his baptism as a full member of the Christian community. But for a proud man whose life had been turned upside down, there was need for some hard thinking. Like Jesus after the crisis of his baptism, Paul went into retreat in the solitude of the neighbouring desert to clear his mind and plan the road ahead. Returning to Damascus with his mind made up, he proclaimed his new faith in the local synagogues with such effect that, having enraged the Jews by what seemed to them his unforgivable treachery, he had to flee from their fury and was ignominiously lowered over the city walls by night in a basket. Some time later, having met with similar opposition from the Jews in Jerusalem, he was sent back to his native city of Tarsus for his own safety. There, and in other parts of Asia Minor and Syria, he spent several years in apparently unspectacular missionary work, until the call came, which put him right in the centre of the stage, where he remained until the end. Meantime, with the dispersal of the more radical Christians from Jerusalem and the conversion of their arch-enemy Paul, the Palestinian churches had a spell of peaceful development. Peter emerges from the record as the most active evangelist among the apostles, and indeed as the foremost advocate next to Paul of a wider view of the church's mission, for which he was taken to task by the more traditional Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. It was at his instigation, and as a result of what he could only believe to be the direct prompting of the Spirit, that for the first time, not merely Samaritans or an African adherent of the Jewish faith, but a Roman army officer and his family were admitted by baptism into the Christian community. It's difficult at this distance of time and with our very different background to realise the intensity of feeling which was aroused among Orthodox Jewish Christians at the prospect of Gentiles becoming part of the fellowship. They saw themselves as the new Israel, the new people of God, and 2,000 years of history behind them had identified Israel and the people of God with the Jewish race. Traditionally, Gentiles were people who lived in pagan darkness and who could only come to the true knowledge of God by conforming to the divinely given law of Moses and becoming incorporated into the people of God by circumcision and acceptance of the other regulations of Jewish life. The fact that some Jews had become Christians, believing that Jesus was the Messiah, did not mean that they were prepared to throw overboard lightly the heritage of centuries. This problem, of how far Christians should conform to Jewish practice was one that bedevilled the church throughout its early years. In Luke's view, and he was himself a Gentile, it was only the incessant prodding of the Holy Spirit which ultimately became irresistible, which persuaded the conservative Jerusalem Christians reluctantly to accept the fact that in the sight of God, Gentiles were as eligible to become members of the people of God as were Jews. Paul was the chief protagonist of this revolutionary doctrine. He carried it to its logical conclusion by maintaining that all that was necessary for membership of the Christian church was commitment to Christ and admission by baptism, and that circumcision and other hallowed Jewish traditions were irrelevant for Gentiles who sought to become members of the new Israel. Luke's view was that it was not only Paul's radical thinking on the matter that was guided by the Holy Spirit, but that God was also speaking to more ordinary minds and directing them in the same way. Thus, as it would seem almost by accident, some of the Jewish Christians who had shared the liberal views of Stephen and had been driven from their homes in Jerusalem and forced to seek refuge in some less bigoted centre, found themselves in Antioch, the Syrian capital. There they had talked about their new faith to all and sundry, as a result of which a strong body of Gentiles had turned from paganism to Christianity. Cautious as always, and suspicious of any untoward developments, the leaders of the Orthodox Jerusalem Church sent a delegate to investigate. This was Barnabas, an open-minded man of splendid character, who at once saw that here was a situation of great promise, which could only properly be handled by one man. So he went off to Tarsus to find him. Thus Paul was summoned out of obscurity to become head of the mission at Antioch. Together he and Barnabas worked for a year there and built it into the first great centre of Gentile Christianity. It was in this city that for the first time the followers of Jesus, who were previously known as Nazarenes or followers of the way, were given the name of Christians, a nickname which, like that of Methodists and Quakers in later times, came to be proudly borne as an honourable title. The irony of the situation cannot have been lost on Paul. He was now leader of a church which his persecuting zeal had been responsible for starting. Persecution of the Christians had again broken out in Jerusalem, this time instigated by the civil power. One of the 12 was martyred, Peter was thrown into prison, and the remainder were scattered. Sympathisers among the prison guard enabled Peter to escape, and before he left the city, he nominated James, the brother of Jesus, as head of the Jerusalem church. Thus, at the end of the first stage of the church's story, about 15 years after the crucifixion, we find two main centres of Christianity: the mother church at Jerusalem, presided over by the ultra-Orthodox James, whose sympathies with Judaism made him more acceptable to the Jewish religious authorities than the 12, and the progressive young Gentile church at Antioch, presided over by Paul, which was becoming the real powerhouse of the faith and the headquarters of the next stage of its missionary expansion. Agreement had been reached between the 12 and Paul before persecution dispersed them, that Paul would make the Gentile world his parish, and accordingly in AD 46 he set out from Antioch on the first of his adventurous missionary journeys. His companions were Barnabas and John Mark, later to become the author of the earliest of the Gospels. They took ship via Cyprus and landed in the south of Asia Minor. Paul seems to have suffered from recurrent bouts of malaria, one of which may have been the cause of their leaving the swampy coastal area and heading north into the mountains. For some unknown reason, John Mark deserted the party and returned to his home in Jerusalem, while Paul and Barnabas went on into Galatia. For all his conviction that his vocation was to be the apostle to the Gentiles, Paul was equally convinced that it was his first duty to preach the gospel to the Jews. They were, after all, the people of God's choice. It was to them that God had spoken through the law and the prophets, and it was to them that the Messiah had been sent as the fulfillment of God's promise that through Israel the world would come to the knowledge of the truth. Accordingly, Paul's normal missionary practice on arriving in a new area was to make contact with the local Jews through the synagogue, and wherever opportunity offered, to proclaim salvation and forgiveness of sins through faith in the risen Christ and not through the law. In the synagogues he found not only Jews, but Gentiles who had become full converts to the Jewish religion, and an even greater number of Gentiles who had discovered in Judaism a meaningful combination of faith and moral principles which they'd sought in vain elsewhere. In the temples and shrines of pagan gods and goddesses, they found religion without morals. In pagan philosophy, they found morals without religion. In Judaism, they found both. But they were not prepared to become full converts because of the Jewish requirement that they must submit to circumcision and accept the multifarious restrictive practices which Judaism imposed. It was on this class of devout and thoughtful pagans that Paul made the greatest impression. They found in the gospel he preached all that they valued in Judaism, without the unacceptable demands of full conversion. It was as much Paul's success in weaning these Gentile adherents away from the synagogues as anything he said about the inadequacy of the law that brought down the wrath of Orthodox Jews upon his head throughout his missionary campaigns. This was the technique Paul adopted on this first missionary venture into hitherto unfamiliar territory. When he was rebuffed by the Jews, he turned to the Gentiles. But Jewish animosity pursued him from one town to another. At one point in his travels, he found himself among superstitious rustics, who took the two apostles to be gods come down to earth, disguised as men. But with Jewish prompting, they were soon equally ready to regard them as devils, and Paul was stoned and left for dead. Yet the result of this turbulent campaign, which may have lasted for up to 2 years, was that Christian communities were established in several centres in Galatia, and Paul could reckon that his efforts had not been in vain. On his return to his headquarters at Antioch, Paul had to face a new problem, this time within the church itself. Some of the right-wing conservative Jewish Christians from Jerusalem had come to Antioch in his absence and had upset the largely Gentile membership of the church there by maintaining that in order to become proper Christians, Gentiles should first become full Jews. That meant not only circumcision and adherence to Jewish food laws, but also avoidance of all social contact with their former Gentile friends. It was perfectly clear to Paul that unless this matter was settled, it would mean the death of the church. There could be no second-class Christians. Gentiles and Jews must somehow learn to live together on equal terms. If the Jerusalem church persisted in its narrow policy, it would mean either 2 separate churches, one for Gentile Christians and one for Jewish Christians, or else the end of the Gentile mission altogether. Some kind of compromise must be reached. Accordingly, a delegation headed by Paul and Barnabas went to the mother church at Jerusalem to thrash the matter out. This meeting of the two sides in AD 49 at the First General Council of the Christian Church ended in victory for Paul and the liberal point of view. It was agreed by the Jerusalem Christians that, subject to minor reservations, Gentiles were to be admitted into the church by profession of faith and baptism, without having to comply with the demands of the Jewish law. Paul's chief supporter among the Jerusalem Christians was Peter, but even the ultra-Jewish James, now head of the mother church, spoke in his favour. The upshot was a written decree embodying the council's decision, armed with which Paul and Barnabas went back to Antioch triumphant. For Paul it was a double victory. Not only had he won his case, but he now had the backing of the Jerusalem church authorities. For one who, however he regarded his own commission as having come directly from Christ himself on the Damascus road, was still treated with some suspicion as not having been one of the original 12 apostles, this was indeed an achievement. It was while he was on his way to this Council of Jerusalem that Paul wrote the earliest of his letters, which have been preserved in the New Testament, to the little Galatian communities which he had founded on his first missionary tour. Apparently they'd been upset by the same type of troublemakers who had questioned Paul's authority at Antioch, and who had insisted on Gentiles accepting Jewish ritual obligations before they could become proper Christians. Paul's letter to them is a massive declaration of Christian freedom and of the equality of Jews and Gentiles in the sight of God.